Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Off the Record. I'm here with Dr. Aaron, can you say it?
Kheriaty.
And this is where we ask just real authentic questions. I'm talking to you as a mom of 2 boys. Yeah. So we want the unscripted, the unpolished, the off the cuff, real answers. Okay, so if you were sitting with Dr. Anthony Fauci, what would you tell him right now? If you had the opportunity.
I would tell him you knew better and you still didn't tell the truth. And you compromised yourself most of all. I think Anthony Fauci is not a stupid person, but I think he wedded himself to institutional forces that did not have the best interests of the American people in mind. He did the bidding of what's called the biosecurity apparatus, basically the people who are involved in research on biological weapons and on military applications of biomedical science and technology. And those interests ended up driving much of our pandemic response. And so I think Anthony Fauci was a smart man, could have been a good public servant, but unfortunately, he did not put the interests of the American people that he was serving first. And I would tell him, I hope you recognize the harm that you've done and that you repent of it and try to make amends before you die.
Yeah.
Because someone who is given great responsibility and an enormous amount of power is going to have a lot to answer for at the end of his life.
Yeah, you know, millions of people were affected by COVID, and people's lives were changed forever, including yours.
Yeah.
Because you were a medical ethics professor at a university in California, and you started questioning kind of some of the things that they were trying to do, including mandates, and you were eventually fired because of that. Can you share a little bit about that experience and then some of the legislation that you got into after the fact because of it?
Yeah, that's right. So I was, as you said, I was at the University of California, Irvine, where I was directing the medical ethics program. And when the university was about to publish their vaccine mandate, I published an article in the Wall Street Journal criticizing that policy. They finalized that policy, and I felt I had to do something more than just speak out against it in the newspapers. I had to do something to try to change it. So I filed a lawsuit in federal court challenging that policy, and the university retaliated by firing me after that, which was difficult. I had expected I would spend the rest of my career in academic medicine. I was going to retire at the university. So that changed the trajectory of where I was going. But I ended up getting involved in the medical freedom movement, ended up getting involved in 2 other lawsuits that were successful.
And one of them went to the Supreme Court.
That's right. We had a free speech lawsuit called Missouri versus Biden that was at the an aspect of the case was at the Supreme Court a couple of years ago. And that's a case that the government is settling with us, which means we're going to get at least a partial win in that case. And that was a case that was challenging government censorship on social media. And so we now know that the government was coercing private platforms like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and so forth to do its bidding during the 2020
and they've
election.
publicly come out and said that. I mean, when Elon Musk bought Twitter, which is now X, that information came out.
Exactly, exactly. Elon Musk opened the back door to some journalists looking at internal communications between the government and Twitter, and the so-called Twitter files basically confirmed what we found on discovery in Missouri v. Biden.
Did that information help you guys?
It did. The 2 things were coming out sort of simultaneously and mutually reinforcing, you know, what the journalists were finding, we were finding in the documents in our case. And then Mark Zuckerberg himself last year went on Joe Rogan's podcast and essentially admitted, also admitted in a letter to Jim Jordan in Congress, exactly what we had alleged in the case. And in fact, to his credit, he said we shouldn't have caved in to the government's demands.
He kind of backtracked a little bit.
He backtracked and issued a kind of apology. And I don't know his heart whether he did that just because the political winds had shifted and there was a new administration, or whether he was sincere in his remorse. I don't know. But regardless, you know, it's almost impossible to deny what we were alleging now in the case. Even though when we filed the case, people were saying, you know, no, this is not happening, and you don't know what you're talking about.
It's a very hard case. I mean, you're essentially going against a huge social media giant, but the government.
That's right. That's right. It wasn't just these huge platforms, but it was the federal government itself. I mean, there's the White House plus 16 other federal agencies, including the FBI, that were named as defendants in our lawsuit. So to get a win in this case is really important for free speech in the United States. And so it's been a privilege to be a part of
How do you think that
those battles.
is going to change the trajectory of censorship in general in America for the future?
I think free speech is going to be an ongoing battle. If you actually look at the history of free speech in the United States, it's a First Amendment right, it's a constitutional right, but it's also a right that continuously has to be fought for. And it tends to be a right that Americans are willing to defend when the person speaking agrees with us, when they're on my side of the political aisle, when I like their ideas or their ideology. And then when the shoe's on the other foot, suddenly we abandon our commitment to free speech. So what I like to tell people is it's important to defend free speech, not just when it's your own speech or speech of people that you agree with, but it's also important to defend free speech even when it's people that you disagree with.
Exactly.
Right? And that's where I think it's been a constant struggle for Americans. And sometimes free speech is an issue on the left, and at other times it's more of an issue on the right. And I think it shouldn't be a political issue. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's a constitutional issue. It's an issue for all of the American people. So yeah, is this case going to help push back a little bit on some government overreach? I think it will. But is it going to put to rest the issue of government censorship? No, I very much doubt it. I think it's something that we always will have to be vigilant on. And I like to tell people, if you don't fight for your constitutional rights using the courts, using the court of public opinion, you doing things like this, talking about it publicly and sharing it on social media, if you don't fight for those rights, then the Constitution is just words on a piece of paper.
Right. You'll lose those rights.
You'll lose those rights.
And since you are or were, I guess, a medical ethics professor, and you are a psychologist as well.
Psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist, sorry.
Yes.
I'm curious your insight and your perspective. Speaking of Mark Zuckerberg, he is undergoing a landmark case right now where people have basically accused him of creating social media to where it was actually physically addicting for kids. Now, the decision and the outcome of this case could be really detrimental for a lot of companies. What is your reaction to what's happening?
I don't want to comment on the specifics of the case because I think the legal question of responsibility and harm is a complicated one. But what I will say is that there's absolutely no doubt that these social media platforms are not only addictive, but they were designed to be addictive. They're designed not to feed you the truth. They're designed to make you keep scrolling.
But I think that's the question is, did they do it on purpose? And did they know the implications, the potential negative implications they could have on children?
So I think, my own view, I think they did it on purpose. I think there's no doubt that they did it on purpose. There are behavioral scientists, many of them work in the gambling industry, right? The reinforcement patterns on slot machines. How often do you need to get some dopamine hit reward for you to keep pulling the lever and putting the money in the slot machine? This has been studied for decades. And the patterns of how to addict people when it comes to not substances, but behavioral addictions like gambling or like scrolling social media, these things are actually very well worked out scientifically. And there's no doubt that the social media platforms use those same approaches that have been employed in Las Vegas for decades to try to make their product more addictive in order to make it more lucrative, because the more you scroll, the more money they make on advertising revenues. That's basically how the business model of the social media companies works. Did they know the harms? I think there's new research coming out on the harms all the time. So what did they know 10 years ago? Probably less than we know now. But there is a growing body of psychological and medical evidence showing the harms of social media, especially on young people, right? That negative mental health outcomes strongly correlate. There's like a direct linear relationship between the amount of time spent using these products and problems like depression and anxiety and, you know, other things that I treat as a psychiatrist. And so I find it impossible to believe that they didn't make these things addictive on purpose.
Yeah.
They did, it's very clear. I find it hard to believe they didn't know at least some of the harms. Yeah. And it's really hard to argue today that there are no harms, because there's just too much evidence now that's accumulated.
Well, it's definitely a case that we're going to be following, and I think it's a good at least that these things are being brought to attention, because I think there is some reform that probably needs to happen. And it's encouraging to see with this new administration the reforms that are happening in the medical industry with RFK. I know that the food pyramid just got reversed. Do you think that's actually going to have an impact, or do you think it's something that's just more symbolic?
No, I think it will have an impact. I mean, it's interesting. We think sometimes these government pronouncements don't have an impact.
Yeah.
But for example, when the Surgeon General finally came out with a warning label for cigarettes, and believe it or not, the tobacco industry fought tooth and nail this idea that cigarettes were causing cancer or other health problems for literally decades when the evidence was accumulating. And we know now that the Surgeon General's decision to basically endorse and acknowledge this idea that smoking leads to lung cancer did have a profound impact on smoking-related behaviors in the United States. It's one of the few cancers that we've made a lot of progress on since the so-called war on cancer began in 1971. The biggest gains have been with smoking-related cancers. And the fact that the government endorsed what science was showing, I think played a significant role there. So I think the food pyramid, you know, there's a lot of busy people there, you know, out there that aren't able or too busy or whatever to process complex information. There's a lot of information coming at people these days. It's hard to know how to sort through it. So if the government comes out with something simple that's a useful guideline, a visual, kind of gives you a quick summary of here's how you should sort of arrange something like your diet habits, it does influence a lot of people. And, you know, there's always going to be skeptics and, you know, people arguing about it. And if you want to do a deep dive and dig deeper, you know, you can go beyond a simplistic graphic like the food pyramid. But there's just lots and lots of Americans that, you know, trust what the government tells them. And something like that will have an impact.
So there is this movement, Make America Healthy Again. We're seeing progress with RFK, like the food pyramid. And this is a little bit controversial, and I'm curious your opinion, because everybody I talk to has a different one. What do you think about this massive rise in people using GLP-1s? And there's this new thing where influencers are saying we're microdosing it. So they're taking a fifth of the prescribed dose, and they're seeing dramatic results. Is it good if people are losing weight and maybe regulating their sugar, even though there's potential bad side effects, or do you say stay away from it completely? And
so my view on GLP-1s is, I would say, nuanced.
Okay.
They are useful for some people. For people with very severe morbid obesity that have tried other interventions, have tried behavioral changes and failed, and, you know, for whom this is causing, you know, not only the direct problems associated with obesity, but all the downstream problems as well. Should they be used carefully in those patient populations for whom nothing else has worked? Yes.
What about for the mom that's trying to lose 10 pounds after having a baby?
so that's where the nuance comes in.
That's what everybody's doing.
I do not think we should be putting Ozempic in the water. I think these are very powerful drugs, and any drug that is that powerful also has risks and downsides. And we know some of those risks already.
Talk about some of them.
So some patients with these drugs get something called gastroparesis, which is, you know, medical jargon for basically paralysis of the muscles in the stomach that allow the stomach to move food through the gut.
That's how the drug works, right? They developed it. They modeled the Gila monster venom the Gila monster lizard venom.
Yes.
They created a synthetic version that paralyzes the stomach. So basically, it causes your food to stay in your stomach so you don't get hungry, which when I think about that, that's like weird.
Well, I think that's one of the mechanisms. I don't think that is the only or the primary mechanism by which it works. And it's not meant to create a situation in which basically the gastroparesis becomes permanent and severe, which happens to some people. And they literally cannot keep food down. And the scary part about that is, even for some patients, it seems like even if you discontinue, if you stop the medication, the gastroparesis might not resolve. So it's not just a potential side effect while you're on the medication. Oh, gee, if it happens, I'll just go off of it. Well, some people going off of it are discovering that that problem is continuing for reasons that we don't entirely understand. So
people
that's
going blind, losing their hair, thyroid cancer.
Severe side effects, and these are all short-term side effects. We don't know the long-term effects of being on a medication like this for 10, 15, 20 years. So I'm wary of any quick fix to a serious and complex problem. And unless we change our food supply, the toxins in our food, that's going to require a lot more work. It's going to require environmental changes to farming, soil, food production, food processing that are complicated, right? But that need to be done. If we just reach for a quick fix medication solution, I think the crisis is only going to deepen and continue, right? We can't put a Band-Aid on this. We have to get at the underlying root cause. So do I want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and say nobody should take Ozempic? No, I don't. Actually, I think for some patients, it could potentially be life-saving, right? But that's a small subset of patients that have a very severe problem. For the person who wants to lose 10, 15, 20 pounds, I think this is not the right way to do it. I think you're putting yourself at very significant short-term risks and a lot of unknown long-term risks.
The risk-reward ratio is not worth it in that case.
I think so.
Okay, I know you have to go. This man is about to go catch a plane, but I have one last hot button topic for you. This is something that has affected a lot of my friends. Not being able to get pregnant, infertility it's on the rise.
Thank you for asking about that.
And I know that
IVF
isn't your favorite option.
Yeah.
Can you explain kind of the ethical implications behind IVF and why that's something you don't agree with?
No, thank you for asking about that. So first of all, let's acknowledge the pain of infertility. 1 in 6 couples that wants to conceive is unable to, and that can be very anguishing. And of course, we want to help. We want to help people that want to conceive, want to have children. There's a birth dearth right now. We're below replacement levels of childbearing. 1.6 children per woman of childbearing age is below the 2.1 number that we need just to replace the population. That's a very serious demographic issue. So this is a significant problem, and the solution seems, from the medical community, the primary solution seems to be, let's reach first for IVF or other assisted reproductive technologies. And if you think about IVF, a couple of issues with it. Number one, it doesn't solve the underlying infertility problem. It doesn't take an infertile woman or an infertile man and make them fertile. What it does is it does a workaround and creates the embryo, creates the new life in the laboratory. It doesn't treat you to solve your underlying issue, whether it's endometriosis or polycystic ovarian syndrome or whatever it is that's causing the infertility and probably causing other health problems for you as well, an attempt to correct the underlying solution. So, like Ozempic, it's a kind of Band-Aid or workaround. The other issue with IVF is that typically, to try to increase success rates of IVF, clinics end up creating more embryos in the laboratory than the couple wants to have in terms of children that they want to implant in terms of establishing a new pregnancy. And those children stay in essentially cold storage, cryopreservation, those embryos, human beings in the earliest stages of life, and they're never given a chance at growth and development in the only nurturing environment, which is the mother's womb, that would allow their life to grow and develop normally. And now we don't know what to do with these literally hundreds of thousands, probably millions of embryos.
Right, because
in cold storage.
As Christians, we believe that life begins at conception.
Life begins at conception.
And so
that is human life, deserving of care.
So we can't kill them.
That's right.
And so what do we do?
So what do we do with them? And this has created a huge problem for which there is no just solution.
Okay, so I'm playing devil's advocate for all the women, all my friends that I'm thinking of. What happens if they say, do 5 or 6 embryos, and they are committed to
implanting all of them? Yeah.
Is it okay at that point?
So a lot of people take that position, and then the complications can still occur because your spouse dies. Boy, I didn't see that one coming. I have 3 embryos left. And he was the father. And so now what do? Maybe I get remarried, and my new spouse wants to have children that are biologically related to him, right? So you end up with unintended consequences of this kind. And the other thing I would tell people who are approaching it from that perspective, try first what's called restorative reproductive medicine, which is, doctors and nurses that are trying to get at the underlying causes of infertility, showing success rates comparable to IVF for lower cost. IVF is very, very expensive. And allowing you to conceive children the natural way, which is a lot more fun, which preserves the integrity of your relationship, so that the new child is born of the love between spouses, not as a kind of manufacturing process in the clinic. So what happens is many couples are told, well, IVF is your only option before they dig into these other options, before they think through all of the complicated ethical implications. And so I would say just pump the brakes and look into restorative reproductive medicine options. Try those before you decide that, this is the only way.
What's the best way to find doctors like that? Just researching, Google?
Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult. There are a handful of them scattered all over the country. You may have to actually travel to find them. But I think the community of people who are doing this is growing. So, I mean, I have a colleague in Southern California. Her name is Dr. Lauren Rubal. She didn't pay me to say this, but a shout out to my friend, Dr. Lauren, who, and she's talked about this publicly, but she used to do IVF, came to see that there were ethical problems with it, got out of that IVF practice, and now practices restorative reproductive medicine. So, I mean, she's a good example of someone, if you're on the West Coast, someone that could be helpful. But there are others.
There's options.
There are options out there if you do some research and you dig into it a little bit. My colleagues and I at the Ethics and Public Policy Center published a document last year talking about this whole issue. People can find that at eppc.org on restorative reproductive medicine. And so there's a lot of co-authors on that, on the different chapters in that document that talk about different aspects of it. So there's a handful of doctors there just among the co-authors of that piece at EPPC. That would be a good place to start if you want to reach out to someone who's trying to approach infertility in this way. I love that. There's resources available. Well, thank you so much for your time, for joining us on Off the Record. Hey, if you guys enjoyed this content, this unscripted, just real life questions, hot button topics, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear from you guys. We'll see you next time.